Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Max Skelton, the director of the Institute of Regional and International Studies, which is based at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. Since our oil and gas webinar last week, some of you have reached out regarding the video recordings. You can access the full recordings of all of these sessions through the IRIS website or through the AUIS YouTube channel. Today, we address the technical and political challenges related to electricity supply and demand in Iraq. First, we will begin with an opening question to each of the panelists. And then after that, we will kind of have an opportunity for the panelists to engage one another with some questions of their own. And then finally, we will open the floor to your questions, which can be submitted by way of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Today's webinar will be a bit shorter than normal, about an hour and 15 minutes. So we have with us today three distinguished speakers, first of which, of course, is the Minister of Electricity, Louay El-Khatib. We thank you very much for taking time to be with us, Minister. And then we have Jessica Obaid, an Academy Associate with Chatham House, and she was formerly the Chief Engineer at UNDP in Beirut. So she brings a wealth of regional experience. And finally, we have our very own Ahmed Dabakhshli. So Ahmed, I'll start with you since you've written quite extensively lately on the electricity sector and the problems that come with dealing with a grid that's been damaged by decades of war and so on and so forth. But we have this kind of persistent problem, which you've laid out, that seemingly no matter how much the increase in the grid supply of power, peak electricity demand is also going up, which means that the gap between demand and supply remains quite wide. And so how can we kind of understand this persistent dynamic? And what does it mean for the expectation on the US side that Iraq will eventually divorce itself from Iranian electricity and gas supply? Yeah, I'm trying to unmute Ahmed's video, but it's somehow not working. Just give us a second to figure out this technical glitch.
Hi there.
There you go, Ahmed.
Yeah, sorry, somehow something must have happened with the internet. So it's not the electricity, the power is still running. So maybe it's just internet. Well, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Mac. Yes, I think what I'd love to do is just to put everybody, especially those who have not followed the sector or understand dynamic, just to look at where we are. And if I may, everybody, I'll share my screen to show you a few slides in order to explain what I'm saying. I think because sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I've got 7 of those, so I think I should be quite interesting. So I think you can see my screen right now. And basically, I think our challenges go back a long time. Our electricity grid has been destroyed over 4 decades of conflict, starting from the Iran-Iraq war did something, but the real damage happened in 1990 onwards. So in a sense, most of us who are aware with the grid, basically the grid consists of 3 parts. The generation part, i.e. what generates the electricity. Then we have the transmission network that take it from there to population centers. And finally, we have distribution. So that in a way puts it. Now, before I go any more, I think for those who don't know, you need to understand that electricity demand and supply is seasonal. So when we talk, in a way, most of the talk I'm talking about would be general for the year. People sometimes misunderstand the difference between, they read figures and they go, wow, great, we're not using Iran. Or wow, we're using Iran too much. You need to look at it in what perspective and what comparison. So in a way, let's kick it off with what it is really. Here, what I'm going to show you is, we've had 4 decades of what went wrong. The issue was, from 2003 onwards, even though we've had significant investment in infrastructure, i.e. there was substantial spending in, I think, 2008 all the way to 2012, the issue with that is it's a combination of mismanagement, corruption, miscommunication. What we end up with is we have a substantially high what's called nameplate capacity, i.e. By the way, every figure I've used, I spent a week looking into the annual reports of the Ministry of Electricity. and they're all PDF. So Luay, by the way, for this year, please make them in Excel sheets so I can use them without manually copying data from 10-year worth of reports. But the data is all from there. And here what you have is the nameplate capacity, which means what our generators can generate. And the green line is actually what they do generate. And you can see the gap is substantial. One of the reasons is, it comes to the gas. I mean, a lot of our generators use the wrong fuel, which means they end up by being at 60% capacity. We have issues with maintenance, issues with heat, and so forth. The gas part is fairly serious. In 2018, less than 60% of the gas generating power plant used gas. So you can see really how far where we are. But that's, in a way, part of what is wrong. So that just shows you the gap. In theory, if we had the right fuels, if we had the right almost everything else, and we would be there. In 2018, by the way, 20% of capacity was just sitting idle, either still in boxes or not being run. So that's 2018 up to there. You look at the next slide, basically is effective generated throughout the year versus demand. So demand is in dark color in red, and the effective is green. The gap looks fairly small because we're looking at the year. But this really kicks in when you take in peak demand and peak generation. Because when the frustration happens, it happens mostly in summer. We have, as everybody knows, brutal summers, and it's not enough. And that's what causes a lot of the damage. Now, the interesting thing is, and what makes it substantially worse for everybody and makes almost every minister's job almost a nightmare, is that just the fact that we're generating those green megawatts does not mean we're delivering them. Because here, in a way, is I think really where it puts it in clear perspective. And you can see almost like the golden lines here. This is demand. Green is what generated, the light green is what generated. And I'm talking actually throughout the year, effective generated gigawatt or terawatt capacity. That's what was generated. And here, the red one is actually what was delivered to homes, with a loss of potentially something like 60% in 2018 of what was generated and what was actually received at the end. And here, there's two things are fairly crucial. And I think it, in a way, will come questions to Luay and to Jessica afterwards. One of the losses is called technical losses, i.e. issue with the network, issue with our distribution. They need cooling, they need maintenance, etc. But a large part of it is actually theft of electricity. So between 40 and 50% of the losses, I mean, we're losing 58% in 2018. We don't have the figures yet for 2019. For 2018, 58% was lost. Almost 40% of that was theft. And that is really where it comes in. Iraqis seem to be willing to pay for generators. We're willing to pay for those, but we have this idea of a social contract where we expect to get paid. And that's actually theft of electricity. And finally, even that small red line is what was delivered. That was what was billed. Actually, billed and paid are two separate things altogether. I think Luay probably will give us more insight on how much of that actually, because people believe that they should not pay for electricity. And without paying for electricity, we will never be able to generate enough to meet demand. And I'll show it in the next few slides. Here is a slide that I borrowed from the IEA's recent report on Iraq. And that shows you the difference in attitude. And basically the IEA used here a normal household. The dark blue is what was generated by the state. And the light blue is what was generated by neighborhood generators. So the state provides almost 75% of what was ever available. And yet what was paid, over 99% was paid to the power generators, and about less than 1% was paid to the state. And the IEA estimated that last year we paid something like $4 billion we paid to those guys, and it's equal to the whole budget, the capital budget that Ministry of Electricity has to work with. Unless we fix this, we're not going to go anywhere. Unless we recreate that social contract and that thing, because it won't happen. Now, finally, just to give you on what happened last year, and that's using some of the data that I collected, which was available for the first 3 quarters of the year. And you can see 2019, we saw a significant improvement of the prior years. Here is, I'm taking it quarter by quarter, and here is for the first 3 quarters of the year. So we were up in terms of generated, about 21%. And the most interesting thing is in the summer, we were up almost 28%, which is quite significant. And I think I would love to know from Luay, what was done to achieve that? Because I think the challenges are technical challenges, but they're also political challenges, and they're also administrative challenges, and a million things in between. How to achieve this is fairly interesting and important to find out what happened last year. Now, this all of us think brings us to where we started, Mac, and that is dependence on Iran. The way I looked at it and the way my research was, basically, my whole argument is that, yes, you can see this is what was generated, the light green bars. The red is the percentage of electricity that was generated through Iranian electricity. We're importing electricity. The blue is gas imports from Iran. And you can see, as of this year, they contributed a significant amount, if we add the two, of what was generated or estimated to be generated in 2019. Now, the Ministry of Electricity, the Ministry of Oil, they were working on replacing the need for Iranian gas, which is really where the biggest contribution from Iran. My issue with that, and I think that's something we need to discuss here, is whatever is done to replace that demand, i.e. whatever comes up from the new round, because currently, by the way, I forgot to mention, currently, Iranian gas represents something like 31% of the gas we use, up from 24% in 2018. So yes, everything I've read in terms of the decisions taken of whatever was needed to replace Iranian gas, we can replace Iranian gas. The issue we have is by the time we replace it, our demand would shoot up sky high, which means in 3 years' time, we replace Iranian gas with domestic gas, but the gap between supply and demand would be just as great, and therefore our energy security would be just as bad. So I think, in a sense, where the states, if it wants to exert pressure, where the world wants to help us, is not in here, is in this part here. This is the chart, again, generated by the IEA, which shows us, line in red, the dotted line, is demand unchecked, i.e. if we do not alter, if we do not change our tariff structure, if we do not move energy subsidies, this is where our demand is. However, the various measures taken by Iraq in terms of increasing capacity, improving the network, can meet demand if we have a rational pricing policy, and if we have an adherence to that, because otherwise we would still, that gap you can see will be there and will continue to be there no matter what. Given our demand, given our population growth, that will never end. So with that, I think I've taken up my 7-8 minutes, and I think this is really where to leave discussion. So where I end up, in a way, is almost like asking Luay, what is the challenges in achieving that, i.e., and also you've been an advocate of tariff reform for quite some time, and there have been a lot of studies on that. What stops it? Not technical, but what political thing stops it? With that, I leave my part, Mac, and I leave it to the rest.
Yeah, and Minister, I'm wondering, in addition to the questions that Ahmed has posed, if you can just broadly comment on essentially whether or not you agree with Ahmed's diagnosis that ultimately dependency long-term on Iranian gas and electricity imports is more or less inevitable. And in addition to that, if you could give us a sense of where you think things are likely to go, given that capital spending, to deal with gaps in the electricity grid is going to go, given the current situation.
Okay. Thank you, Mac, and thanks to Iris for hosting me, and thanks to Ahmed for the excellent slide pack you presented. I do agree to a certain extent on I would say most of the facts and figures that you featured. There are some figures need to be corrected, but in general, it's a very realistic presentation. The thing is that the challenge is not very much on like the technical side. The technical side is, yes, it's one of the challenge, but we also need to address the commercial side of it, as you rightly said, which is the tariff reform. And I would add to that is the security situation. this is something that we really need to highlight and we need to pay attention. I mean, you mentioned about the nameplate design of the national grid, which is could be as much as 30,000 megawatts. But we have to take into consideration the actual working capacity. You really need to take off at least 25% of that generation capacity that was completely destroyed during the occupation of Daesh. Also around 20 to 25% wear and tear. So we can only talk about 21. Just about over or 20,000 megawatts. Now, the thing is that even this capacity, it doesn't go like to the full design level because of performance or weather condition, etc. So today we have reached, practically speaking, 19.2 gigawatts of electricity. Now, with this capacity, if we implement a proper tariff reform, where the power generation, transmission, and distribution, and the management of the sector all included in that tariff, and basically we completely remove subsidies, I can assure you this generation is enough to provide us electricity 24/7, even during peak time. But the thing is that without the tariff reform, it's going to be impossible to achieve such ambition because of the demand is growing tremendously. On the basis of, well, it's simple. When the price is zero, demand is infinite. And guess what? The subsidies of the initial categories for the consumers exceeds 90%. So the consumers here are literally on using electricity on full blast. And this basically lead to injustice of distribution and consumption. That's one thing. The other thing, on the security side, I mean, you mentioned something about the 1991 episode that hit Iraq badly during the Gulf War. I would add to that and also the 5 years occupation of Daesh, of ISIS, to the occupied territories. And people may say, but again, the ISIS intervention did not impact the South. Yeah, it did impact the South because we're talking about one national grid. So regardless of the locality, that level of impact goes across the whole national grid. The other thing is that we need to remember the tough days of the civil unrest between 2004, 2008, and also the continuous attacks that impacting our transmission lines. Just in the past 72 hours, many high tension lines and high voltage lines been attacked by terrorists, and this impacted eastern Baghdad and so many provinces, including Diyala, Nineveh, and Salah ad-Din and Kirkuk. So with limited cash and limited resources, and special forces need to clear out all these areas. We are fighting on different front lines in terms of like sorting out the security issues, sorting out the technical issues and reconstruction to bring power back, and also trying to work on closing the gap between supply and demand, as planned according to our national roadmap. And on top of that, of course, the financial crisis that we are now facing that will force us, and has already forced us, to revise all our plans and strategies, and to work out something that really basically to customize it to the new realities. This is a situation that has completely, especially the pandemic, has completely shaken all our plans and even our financial aspiration when it comes to meeting the requirements for the roadmaps and the key contracts that we've signed with American companies, European companies, and Chinese. And these things need to be taken into consideration. So all to kind of like wrap it up, I mean, the challenge of the electricity in Iraq, it's technical, commercial, security, and legacy, and now financial challenges. These are realities that everyone needs to understand, and on the commercial side I think is the toughest challenge, because we need to sort out the tariff reform in a way that is people really pay for the kilowatt they consume. At the moment, we have 4 million registered units. Let it be government, household, industry, commercial, agriculture, so on. And those 4 million units, I would say 50% of them thrive on power piracy. In addition to that, we have about 1 million units, what I call squatters. Also, they receive 24/7 electricity that is unpaid for. So all this adds to the financial liability, which leading to the figure of about $12 billion that the government pays on behalf of the people every year, based on last year's oil prices. And this needs to be sorted. I would end at this point, and happy to receive any questions.
Thank you, Minister. And I know Ahmed and Jessica will want to come back with some questions in a minute. But so far, Jessica, we've kind of been focusing on the technical and market dynamics at play. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of bring more of a political economy into this, given that you've been working on the policy side and have dealt with these kind of more specific solutions where there's been there's been a policy attempt to inject solutions into the supply generation side in other minute contexts, and how this might relate to the Iraq context.
Yes, and I'm just going to add a few challenges, sadly, and mention why also on the technical front, we're going to have socio-political economic challenges. So when we look into the technical problems of Iraq, they're actually quite common, and you need to increase power generation, decrease the technical and non-technical losses, secure a continuous supply of natural gas, and hike the tariff. But doing all that seems quite simple, but we see that it normally takes several years to implement these kind of reforms. So normally the elephant in the room is not technical, but the vested interest in the sector, the governance structure, and the socio-political context that is often overlooked in so many different countries with similar problems. So reforming the power sector requires political consensus, or diluting the vested interest and the political influence in the electricity sector. But since reaching political consensus is typically hard, historically we see that it gets easier to implement reforms when there is an actual economic crisis. So it's normally unsustainable debt, low oil prices that trigger the reforms in the power sector. But that also has some its own challenges, because when governments are in economic crisis, they have a sense of urgency. They need some sort of fast solution, which often compromises long-term sustainability. And when we add to that some vested interest in the power sector, it also sometimes means overlooking the least cost planning, and there might be a lack of transparency, which might also compromise the value for money. And so restructuring and reforming the power sector historically on different countries in developing countries, we see that it's non-linear and it might take different phases and it gets developed through different lessons learned. I'm gonna share some slides. One second. So this shows the reserve margin or the shortage of electricity in countries in the region. We see that actually Iraq is not the worst. Lebanon is the worst in terms of percentage difference between the peak demand and the available installed capacity. On the economic level, the power sector, when we have a non-functioning power sector, it means we have fiscal deficit, mostly resulting from the losses and the subsidies, but we also have a cost on the economy resulting from the value of lost load and cost on business competitiveness. So if we ask businesses in Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq on the top barriers for doing business, and we see them in the World Bank doing business reports, is going to be either the first or the second is going to be the electricity and the cost of electricity in the case of Jordan. And in case of Lebanon and Iraq, of course, because you have expensive diesel generators to mine the shortage gap, it also results in higher bills, electricity bills. We also have to worry about the growth in demand. So it's a mix of subsidies that always lead to wasteful consumption. And subsidies normally also do not necessarily go when you're to the people who need it, because the more anyone is consuming electricity and the government is subsidizing it, it means that the richest population is actually benefiting more from the subsidies. In the case of Lebanon, it would be, I don't know what it is in Iraq, but in the case of Lebanon, it's 38% of the subsidies go to the richest population, whereas 16% go to the poorest population. So this is for data from the IMF, and we see how the expenses, the share of the expenses of the GDP versus revenue, and we see a wide gap. That's mostly the fuel, the losses, and the subsidies. But I also want to stress a lot on the non-technical losses. So we also see here in the region a comparison of the percentage of the losses, and we see Iraq is one of the highest in the region. And also it's worth noting that governments often underreport the extent of non-technical losses, but they tend to overestimate the ability to reduce them. So we see in planning most often that these governments would normally assume, whether in Iraq and Lebanon or other developing countries, that you can cut down losses from 50% to 0%, assumingly, in 5 or 6 years, which is not realistically going to happen. If we see the cost of, so here the light blue is the cost of electricity, the average electricity tariff, and the dark blue is actually the cost of generation. So that's the difference. But if we're going to add the non-technical losses to that, it's going to get higher. So even if we're going to eliminate the subsidy to an average, let's assume to an affordable kind of electricity cost, because they cannot hike the tariff to 28 cents in Lebanon, for example, because it will absolutely kill the economy, or 22 cents in Iraq. So decreasing this non-technical losses is very important. And we see that in different developing countries, when there is elimination of subsidy, it does not necessarily mean that there's going to be a drastic decrease in fiscal deficit. So adding power generation without drastically cutting down on losses is going to actually lead to higher fiscal deficit. And hiking the tariff with a lack of maintenance, rehabilitation of existing power plants, and with an inability to secure gas supply and might maybe switch back to oil is going to lead to a higher deficit. Hiking the tariff in the absence of government authority to showcase that the that it's going to take actions against illegal connections, and when there is no trust in government, is going to lead to higher deficit. But hiking the tariff is always easier planned than implemented, and we have to account for the socio-political context. So in the cases of Iraq and Lebanon, we see that citizens do not, there's an illegal connection, but there's also non-billing and non-collection from the utility or the government side. But we see that even the people who have illegal connection from the state tend to pay their full bills for the private generators. And it's worth mentioning that when citizens have less faith or trust in the government, they feel that they're entitled to have some sort of free services. So the more this gap is going to widen between citizens and the government, the more people are going to feel entitled to steal electricity. So there's need to build the citizens' trust. I think I've used all my time, so maybe I will get back to this later. We also need to build the investors' trust, because as has been mentioned, there's going to have to be drastic cuts in government spending, which means there have to be more engagement from the private sector and having to build that enabling environment and a better business investment climate.
Thank you, Jessica. Ahmed, we'll turn to you for the first question.
Okay. Well, the first one will be to Luay, but there's a part of it as well to Jessica. And it goes like this. I mean, I went through the need of Iranian gas, and I'm sure Luay has been sort of continuously in dialogue with the Americans every few minutes of how far we are and so forth. Do the Americans realize the challenges that are there? I mean, when they are putting these restrictions on you and they see the progress being made, but also they see the futility of that progress, because you make that progress and you're still where you are. Do they see that? And they also obviously push for using other sources, i.e. other suppliers, i.e. using, from the GCC, either gas or electricity, or from neighboring countries. There are plans for linking to Kuwait and then ultimately linking to Jordan. And also, in a way, partly to Luay and partly to Jessica, is that the chart you've seen is that some countries have more electricity than they need. And so therefore, how do we ensure that we can create that between us, that linkage whereby it's some sort of electricity market, but also do not increase our dependence on them without anything in return, because you end up by depending on someone, you end up by being at their mercy one way or the other. So I'm done.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I've got a few comments. One for Ahmed and others in response to Jessica's presentation. And to answer your question, Ahmed, when it comes to how understanding the United States to our situation, I think all the officials that I meet from the US government, they are very understanding. It's just like when the facts and figures reaches DC or the White House in specific, the decision seems to be like more like not in tandem to what the realities that we are facing. To start with, we've made it very clear we don't want to take party in this dispute between Tehran and Washington DC. We are a strategic partner to the United States, and we are good friends to all our neighbors and neighboring countries. And we are not interested to be part of any dispute of this. We came from years and decades of wars, sanctions, and misery. And we need to build our national capacity and our energy security and our ambition to achieve energy security. This is Iraq's ambition, not because we've been told or we've been asked by others to do so. That's to start with. So let's clear this. Second, we worked on other alternative, not to kind of like to make the dependency on Iranian gas or Iranian electricity less than, I mean, just to basically to replace them or whatever. No, it's because this is a free market. We want the best deal. At the moment, I mean, first of all, when I became minister, I came to a portfolio that has already signed agreements with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Having said that, when I looked into other alternatives in attempt to find competitive offering on the table, I couldn't find something that could provide something immediately. Yes, we spent a lot of time in 2019 to negotiate agreements and deals with neighboring countries with regards to achieve the interconnectivity projects. But and we signed one with the GCCIA, and in the process of negotiation with the Saudis, we close to sign an agreement with the Jordanians, and if it's not for the caretaker administration limited authority, we could have signed it with Turkey as well. But again, these projects needs time. The closest we're talking about 8 months or 6 months. Just the GCC one requires about a year, and they haven't started yet. And we've signed that back in September last year. So there are no kind of like alternative that could provide something immediately. On the gas side, the cheapest for us is the Iranian gas. The other alternatives is through LNG. And you do the maths and see how sensible or how challenging the LNG compared to pipeline prices. So looking on other alternatives is building our own capacity. And this is what we've done. We've added about 3.5 gigawatts of electricity in less than a year. And we have plans to add similar capacity in 2020. And if it's not for the pandemic and for the limitation of executive authority of the government, because we've been forced to resign a few months back, we could, I mean, these megawatts could have been a possibility for this year. But now our aspiration reduced to 1,000 megawatts. So we could achieve about 20,000 megawatts or a bit more by summer this year. Having said that, all these alternatives, including the renewables that we've started in removing the feed-in tariff and planning for the bid rounds that should have taken in the first week of October and the second bid round of February 2020, all these been shelved simply because of the circumstances of the country. I don't need to consume more time to list them. So all these initiatives, projects, alternatives, and so on, we visited them, we touched them. In fact, the Ministry of Oil also working on developing the gas capabilities. On the southern part, on the associated gas, Basra Gas Company is working on their basically developing that capacity. In addition, we have the Arbawi gas hub. But again, the Ministry of Oil waited for long time for a US company consortium to sort out their differences and sign a contract. And eventually those companies decided not to go ahead. So that's a waste of time. In addition to that, we have other options from the Kurdistan region of Iraq to bring gas from the Khormor gas fields. But again, this also requires about 6 to 12 months, and we are working on this at the moment. And it requires pipeline and infrastructure, gas processing capacities, and so on. So when we talk about alternatives, one should not expect these alternatives could happen just like that in no time. Time matters. And also we need cooperation from all stakeholders to move things forward. In addition to that, we are working on basically, we are working with other multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, the IEA, and other energy institutions to help us moving things forward. But again, one of the biggest challenges is the financial situation that we need to sort out, and it will force us to reconfigure the whole thing as we move on. So this is kind of like just a quick answers to you and to Jessica's numbers. And needless to say that it was not only the power generation we added significantly to it in the past 15 months, but also the mega projects that we landed on, and on the transmission and the distribution, as well as clearing the bottlenecks and some of the projects that's been hindered since 2010. I mean, when I became minister, I saw a list of like tens of projects that have been kind of like frozen since 2010. And I had to put a strategy to unlock them and move them forward. Don't ask me why they've been frozen and why previous governments did not move them forward. I mean, some of them completely out of occupied territories during ISIS. But our team at the ministry and the various public companies did a great job with our contractors to move things forward. And this has improved in the performance of the grid. And for the first time in Iraq's history, there were no protests against electricity. In fact, the annual rituals that used to happen in Basra on electricity and bringing down governments never happened in 2019, when Basra enjoyed 24/7 electricity during peak time. And we managed to meet demand and close the gap between supply and demand to a certain extent, because we have to remember that the demand is pushed because of the various factors, including population growth, about 2.8%. And I think I totally agree with Jessica's slides when it says that it's around 8% demand growth on power generation year on year. But this could only be fixed and corrected if the tariff reform takes place. One point I wanted also to mention that we have also one of the reforms, the institutional reforms that we've been working on, and this is the corporatization. Iraq the parliament issued a law back in 2017 to split regulators from regulated bodies and to define the operatorship of the sector. But again, this law needs to be corrected and need to be kind of like put in the right way, so the corporatization process take a better shape as we reform the practice of the regulator or regulated bodies.
Jessica?
Yeah, I had a question today actually on the grid and the grid connection and purchasing electricity from other countries. In theory, it's supposed to improve energy security because you're diversifying the sources of supply. But we know Jordan has a pure economic motive because Jordan has an excess of electricity and it's purchasing expensive electricity and it needs to make some additional profits. But do you worry, like in the case mostly of the Gulf as well, that it might actually be used as well for political leverage?
With Jordan, we negotiated a deal and this will only materialize in about 24 months because it all depends on the mega contracts that we approved at cabinet level for GE to rehabilitate the transmission systems and the substations basically on the western part and the liberated provinces. These projects, we're talking about like 700 over 700 kilometers of transmission lines and nearly 20 substations. These need to be like implemented and time matters. The rate is very much on par with the Iranian electricity imports. The GCCIA deal, I think it was 15% less than the Iranian price. But again, this requires about a good 1 year to be implemented. Having said that, during the renewal times, now the Iranians are offering now a much more competitive rates to the GCCIA and the Jordanians. So it's a free market. What really matters to me as a minister, as a client to all those neighboring countries, I need the best rate, the fast time of delivery, and I care less about the identity of that megawatt or molecule of gas. And this is a message to our friends in the United States.
We're going to now turn to some questions that are coming into the Q&A, and I'd also encourage our panelists to scroll through those. If you note any that seem particularly interesting to you, you feel free to pose them to the group. But we'll start with one about, you know, and it's been already raised as an issue, but perhaps we can go into some further details. What are the kind of political and technical challenges that come with increased electricity interconnection with the KRG, you know, on the gas side, particularly? There's been reports that have come out on this issue in the last few days, especially, but we have several participants that would like to have more details.
Yeah, we have formed a team that will soon visit the Kurdistan region of Iraq to discuss in detail our plans with regards to interconnectivity, the usability of the basically spare capacity of power generation, but we also need to look into the fuel security for that, because there's two sides of it. Like there's the installation itself, the power system, and then we have the fuel. So we need to look into that. And this when we talk about gas, we talk about like timelines and projects that need to be considered. So far, the most plausible options are the Khor fields. There are a potential timeline that good capacities of gas that could feed into the national pipeline grid and across the country, specifically feeding into the Midland side and the northwest of Iraq. For the first 6 months, if implemented, we have a good 150 million standard cubic feet, then building up to 300 and so on. There are, I'm quite sure there are other assets of gas producing assets in Kurdistan region, but again, we need to the technical staff from the Ministry of Oil to assess this, the possibility of these assets, whether it's a sour gas, it's easy gas, or I mean, in terms of like the implementation and the requirements for the pipelines and the processing capacity. So again, any agreements requires funding and timeline to be implemented. We're not talking here a few months. I mean, right. Yes. I mean, the shortest possibility is from the former, and we're talking about 6 months. Okay. That's the shortest one. But other projects, undeveloped fields or and requirements of pipeline, we're talking about a good 1 to 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Ahmed, did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we don't have time. I mean, and the urgency is there, and everything takes a few years. What delays things on our part? I mean, some things are clearly delays because technically they take a long time to happen, i.e. building a pipeline, putting it down, all the stuff. But there is a lot of stuff as well. The elephant in the room that we haven't really touched upon as yet, vested interest and corruption in a way. One of the things that we always see when it comes to Iraq, there is every kind of, and I think Mac, you've done some work as well with it on terms of what you call the political marketplace. Almost every stage, I mean, laying down a pipeline from here to here, it passes by so many interests. They add cost, they add time, and it takes forever. How? I mean, in the year and a half that you've had in the ministry, what did you see that actually, adds to the time element? And to Jessica, from what you've read and you've talked about it a lot, how can these be addressed? How can these be addressed in a way that we get there, that this whole year and a half, the non-technical, the marketplace, the political thing in it, how long can we cut that down by?
Minister, maybe we could start with the minister on this, just to, we'll kind of start with Iraq and then we'll broaden out. So to focus the question in, this notion of a kind of political marketplace where you have so many vested interests that can at any point in a complex distribution chain create problems. How have you dealt with this sort of political side to the grid, Minister?
Well, first of all, when we talk about the electricity, we really need to talk about the energy sector at large. This energy portfolio, let it be on the oil side or the electricity ministry side, should have been always, just like security, it must not be kind of like subject to politicization, because once you kind of like impose quota system and politicization on top of it, then we are literally compromising the national security. Let it be directly to on the people or the impact of the economy. So my advice is, I mean, I don't want to talk about the era that preceded my appointments, because this is very much visible and known to everyone. The energy portfolio must not be politicized or subject to quota system, because doing so, you are literally spelling a suicide sentence, like a death sentence, sorry, to the country. The interference of political parties, the interference of the various groups and so on could certainly add, they certainly added a lot of challenges. Having said that, we had to fight this viciously, and this has been kind of like exemplified by the number of calls from Parliament dragging me just 4 times in the past 2 months after assuming my job. And the other thing is that the number of calls to question me and trying to try me basically on, as if like I'm responsible of all the miseries from 2003 to 2018. Having said that, one really need to look into the whole issue of the electricity, that the technical challenge, although it was since 1991, but from 2003, to be specific, from 2006 till now, we have added at least 16 gigawatt of electricity compared to the power generation level that Iraq achieved on the 9th of April 2003. So we're talking about significant capacity. This is not counting the further capacity that was implemented and destroyed during the Daesh days. To cut the long story short, this sector needs to be completely out of the hand of the political party or the politicization, should I say, and should really look into it as a national security matter. And this is a hashtag I launched, that the electricity sector is a national security matter, and it's a collective responsibility. It's not just a Ministry of Oil Electricity responsibility. It's basically the responsibility of all stakeholders, including the consumers, or to start with the consumers, that must not abuse the national grid with power pirates.
Sorry, Jessica?
Yes, and I wanted to add to that, reducing monopoly is very important when you have so many vested interests in the sector. This is why corporatizing and restructuring normally an electricity utility is very important. And I also want to stress on the need for decentralized generation and how it can also enhance the security, especially when you have political clashes and some sort of conflicts in these areas. So distributed generation, and especially for renewable energy, would also have so many benefits in mitigating some of these challenges.
We have thanks, Jessica. We have a couple of other questions that I want to pose to the panel. This one I will just read verbatim because maybe the force of it will be lost if I don't. Minister, let's say the next prime minister comes to you either as a minister or advisor and says, okay, let's reform or abolish tariffs on electricity to get to a fully commercial model. If that were to happen, how would you suggest Iraq goes about it? What steps would need to be taken?
Well, first of all, I would focus on completely removing the subsidies and reform the tariff, and this is a great opportunity to reform the economy because of the condition of the oil market, and basically people now stop dreaming about unnecessary or luxurious revenues from oil. So basically, removing the subsidies completely. Now, one may ask, what about the people like on the poverty line and poor people? Yes, we can take them into consideration by having proper registration through the national social security system, and make sure they receive some financial benefits, sensible financial benefits, and in financial tokens. But again, let it be rich or poor, everyone needs to pay for the kilowatt they consume, because that system of giving subsidies to everyone is not going to work, and it will continue to squander our assets. So remove subsidies and improve social security system to support people in need, to give them financial compensation, but with kind of like limited income, not like kind of like a carte blanche where everyone expect to use in every single room there is an air conditioning system, whatever. One need to be realistic.
And Minister, you seem on the issue of tariff reforms, even if we put the politics of it aside, which are obviously enormously difficult, how are we to be confident that it would actually sufficiently adjust demand?
Yeah, the thing is that this tariff reform requires three things. Number one, a cabinet decision, not just a ministry. The ministry, we've made our mind and we submitted our recommendation to the government. That's we've done it long ago. We need a cabinet decision, but for cabinet decision to materialize, we really need political support from parliament. We don't want people to play patriotic and launching cliches here and there and trying to be heroes on TV to stop this to happen. We're talking here about like a situation that is no more sustainable whatsoever. If the governments in the past that used to pay or carry what is equivalent to about $12 billion of subsidies, it's not going to happen. We don't have this amount just about to pay the needful for salaries and state maintenance, etc. So the second thing is the political support, and the third thing, social understanding, public understanding of the new reality. So these three factors need to be in place, and this requires a major educational campaign to move things forward. Yes, we can kind of like move with kind of like phasing out subsidies within say a 2 years plan or whatever, but most certainly within 24 months, we need to remove these subsidies and replace compensation for people in need through other agencies such as the social security system.
Across the Q&A, and I think this applies for all panelists, there's been a number of questions around the potential for renewables, as well as the kind of structural reform regarding decentralization of generation. I'm wondering if any of you in the panel have comments on those two issues.
I want to state something, and I think Robin asked as well on why we're not seeing so many renewable energy projects in both Iraq and Lebanon. And it follows different things. And first, when we have political inconsistency and lack of political stability, and normally the long-term sustainability plan is compromised. but also the majority are looking, at least on the political side, are looking for some sort of fast win, which is to ensure a fast electricity supply. And so on the agenda of ministries, typically when it's Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Electricity, in Lebanon it's Ministry of Energy, that's also dealing with the oil exploration, water. So on the agenda and the priority, renewable energy falls down. But also you need a different kind of mechanism. Renewable energies throughout the Middle East and elsewhere are through IPPs, independent power producers. So it depends largely on attracting private sector and attracting financing. In the case of Lebanon, reaching financial close where the developer would be able to get all the necessary equity and loan has also been hard in the case of any RPP. So you also need all this new regulatory framework. And I also wanted to mention that the procurement and the regulatory framework are very important, but they're also often compromised or overlooked in developing countries.
Mm.
I would second what Jessica mentioned, and just wanted to make in the case of Iraq, when we started back in 15 months ago, we put this as a kind of like high in our priority. And basically what we've done, we removed the feed-in tariff that was imposed by previous administrations to make the market more kind of like lucrative for investors to come in. And we succeeded in attracting a number of multinationals to move. And we worked closely with the IHC and to basically better define, to define a better model for local companies and multinationals to make their entry easy in Iraq. As I mentioned earlier, the first bid round was planned to take place on the first week of October. We were targeting 755 megawatts of electricity, and the second bid round was planned for the February 2020 to target a good 1,000 megawatts, with an aspiration to achieve 20% of the renewable as part of the energy mix by 2030. This is part of our roadmap, but unfortunately, none of that happened because of the protest and so on that prevent all the circumstances and the scenes that we've seen in various provinces that basically pushed back all those investors not to come in and do. I mean, I receive a lot of calls and tags and so on social media saying that, why don't you use renewables? Why relying on import? As if like this is like with a magic word, everything could happen. I mean, a lot of countries had to work very hard in creating the environment to improve the tariff, let alone improving the business environment to welcome companies. And this requires a safe environment and commercially attractive for investors to embark on.
We have another question, sort of, it's related to the decentralization question, but it's a follow-up on the KRG issue. And it's basically to say, let's think about the political dynamics of this. You know, the PUK, the KDP, how willing are they really to allow the federal government to use the KRI's gas resources? What will be some of the political costs and dynamics that would come into play with those kinds of negotiations between the federal and regional government?
Well, first of all, this is when we talk about gas and oil, we talk about Iraqi gas and oil. So regardless of the locality, this is Iraqi gas and oil. That's to start with. Second, I mean, these things, I think, I don't think will face any issues. I think during our meetings with the KRG administration, they expressed eagerness to cooperate in this, because as I mentioned, developing that feedstock capacity of gas will not only feed into potentially the areas outside the Kurdistan region, but also potentially as these companies become in a better position commercially, they will help developing that local capacity and meet growing demand within the region. So it's a mutual benefit, and it makes no sense whatsoever not to move on developing gas capacities ASAP on these issues. And I think the KRG, I mean, I personally, during the meetings that I had with the KRG administration, I found them very cooperative and helpful, and things will move on smoothly in the coming days and weeks.
Mm-hmm. So we are going to, in the last 10 minutes, just give each panelist an opportunity to have some closing thoughts. I'd like to kind of try and frame the last few minutes here as forward-looking. We have the COVID-19 issue, which obviously, at least temporarily, has changed the energy dynamics quite a bit. Well, actually not temporarily, for quite a long time. We have a huge budget shortfall, which is going to impact the capacity of the new administration, if there is one, to invest in the power supply grid. What realistically can we expect going forward in terms of the political and technical challenges going forward as we potentially move into a new government? And we'll start with Jessica, and then we'll go to the minister and to Ahmed.
It's very hard to forecast because, as I said earlier, just because a government has started implementing reforms doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a linear trajectory or that it's going to be continued like it started at the same pace. But I just want to highlight one, I think, important matter is that the importance of having a regulator and a strict mandate for each institution. Normally when you have all the power within one entity, it's going to be subject to political influence, but mitigating that political influence can be through a regulator with mandates to plan long-term vision. I'd like to see throughout all the Middle East long-term sustainable visions for the power sector that account for the energy mix, but also for renewable energy and alternative energy in general. And that's not only because we need to reduce emissions and because we have high emissions and we have generators in Iraq and in Lebanon that have terrible greenhouse gas emissions, but also because it makes economic sense. So we need this kind of long-term policy in place that can only be mitigated, that can only mitigate the political inconsistencies through having a separate division or a regulator, but that's not subject to political influence.
Thanks, Jessica. Minister?
Well, Mac, if I want to be a bit positive and forward-looking on this, despite the fact that everyone like talking about the daunting realities of like post-pandemic and the days after coronavirus will be completely different, and painting all these challenging scenarios, I see in this on the day after pandemic an opportunity, and in fact an opportunity within this crisis. I think the whole humanity, specifically the people of Iraq, needed a realistic wake-up call, and this wake-up call is to kind of like how to survive using proper means of living, and not to rely on some sort of a welfare state feeding basically everyone salaries through government jobs, and without paying any attention to the priorities of building our country. What we really need to look into is act on the reform, economic reform, on the power sector specific, on the tariff reform. We have moved on good miles in terms of like developing the private sector. Now the power generation I would say close to 50% is dominated by IPPs, by private sector. And eventually, I would like to see the days where the private sector running the show on the distribution and the power generation, leaving the transmission system under the control of the states. And we have a proper tax system, a proper tariff system, and a proper social security system that protects the interest and the welfare of people in need. But in addition to that, when it comes to the decentralization, I think we really need to work on fixing our federal system at large. I mean, if I may talk about something just quickly on the non-electricity issues. The last paper I published before assuming my government job, it was fixing Iraqi federalism. And my focus was on the 4 key laws and institutions that unfortunately been neglected, not to be discussed or even kind of like, sorry, not to be kind of like materialized since the first federal government was established back in 2006. And those are the upper house, the federal council, according to Article 65 in the Constitution, the federal court, according to Article 92, the revenue sharing law, according to Article 106, and the hydrocarbon law, according to Article 112. So collectively, those laws and relevant and corresponding institutions, together with the Council of Ministers and the Parliament, will define the federal state and basically put the basis for a proper decentralization and establish pave the ground for market economy as we move on.
Thank you, Minister. Ahmed?
Okay, well, I'm going to say a few things, but then I think somehow somebody took them from my mouth. So I said a few things that I wanted to say, but so I will just sort of go over there. Yes, I think in a way, definitely, this is an opportunity for us and a massive opportunity for a wake up, because everything that we've seen so far, at least what I've seen on the political front, is that almost there is a strong belief that this is a crisis that will pass away one way or the other, that there is a nice post-COVID world. Now, everything I've seen suggests that no, it's not, because I think ultimately the long-term picture for us depends on oil. And everything that you see on oil, and I'm going to repeat something I said a little while earlier, is that a few months ago, the IMF published a report that was suggesting a different story on oil demand for the next few years. But the thing which was very relevant to us comes into the GCC. It was arguing that within 15 years, the GCC will deplete its financial wealth, and 10 years later will deplete its net worth. Because if it carries on with the policies that they are, the GCC woke up in 2014, and the shock of oil got them to begin to reverse the role of the paternalistic state. We need to, and for us, they have financial wealth, they have huge infrastructure, we have none of that. So if they have 15 wealth depleted, what do we have? And I think in a sense, given the severity of the crisis, and if anything in my mind, all that COVID has shown us, an inevitable future that would have happened anyways in 15 years' time, but we got it now in a small, short 2-year dose. So in a sense, I think the minister, when he said that this whole process of electricity needs to be moved away from the political process, absolutely. We have to do that on 2 fronts, on the level of the muhafasa within Iraq itself, and also on the relationship between the federal government and the KRG. We need to move from the past into a way whereby, unless we solve these things through the reforms, and we know the reforms, there's nothing new in any of us what we said. All of these things, there have been studies on them, they are out there. But what was missing was the will, the political will, the coordination. That we need to do it. And if we don't, the longer we delay, the more trouble comes in. But yes, it is an opportunity for us to finally break loose from this nightmare of state dependency, of going nowhere. Absolutely, I think this is the opportunity. But unless I think some of us see how deep the abyss can be if we don't act, then we will squander the opportunity. But I definitely think there is a chance, every chance, to renew, because this is an opportunity, because unless this chain of oil dependency is broken, we're not going to go anywhere as a country. We haven't gone anywhere as a country in 40 years as a result of that curse one way or the other.
Thank you, Ahmed, and thank you to all of our panelists. And also thank you to our AUIS and IRIS staff for working so hard to put this on. We look forward to additional webinars in the coming weeks. We'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all. And thanks for those who joined.